The wind howled through the cracked window of the attic, but Julian didn't hear it. He was too focused on the rhythmic scratching coming from inside the walls. He had moved into the Blackwood estate thinking it was a bargain, a Victorian masterpiece left to rot. But within 3 days, the house felt less like a building and more like a predator. It started with the shadows that didn't match the furniture, then the smell of wet earth in the hallways, and finally, the whispers. The scratching grew louder, moving from the wood into the floorboards beneath his feet, pulsating like a heartbeat. He held his flashlight tight, the beam flickering against a door that hadn't been there yesterday, a small, wooden hatch near the baseboard, sealed with a rusted iron bolt. Driven by a morbid curiosity that felt like a cold hand pulling his heart, Julian slid the bolt back. The air that rushed out was freezing and smelled of ancient decay. He peered into the darkness and saw thousands of small, white spheres. They weren't stones. They were human teeth, piled deep into the foundations of the house. As he reached out, the scratching stopped instantly, replaced by a voice that seemed to vibrate directly inside his skull, a wet, clicking sound that formed his name. He looked up to see a figure standing in the corner of the room, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bent at angles no human joint could achieve. It had no skin, only a raw, red surface that shimmered in the flashlight's dying glow, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a jagged hole overflowing with more teeth. The creature didn't jump. It simply leaned forward, its neck stretching longer and longer until its face was inches from his. Julian tried to scream, but his jaw felt heavy, his gums aching with a sudden, agonizing pressure. He watched in the mirror across the room as his own teeth began to fall out of his mouth, clattering onto the floor one by one, only to be replaced by sharp, blackened needles pushing through his skin. The creature grinned, showing 1,000 rows of stolen smiles, and whispered that the house was finally hungry again. As Julian collapsed, the room began to warp, the floorboards stretching like pulled taffy until the very dimensions of the attic felt wrong. The pile of teeth on the floor began to vibrate, skittering across the wood like frantic insects, gathering around his paralyzed body. He felt their cold, hard surfaces pressing against his skin, sinking into his flesh as if his body had turned to soft clay. The creature, now a towering mass of pale, clicking bone and raw muscle, began to fuse with the shadows of the room, its voice multiplying into a choir of 1,000 different screams, all muffled and distant. "You are not the first," the voices harmonized, "and you are far from the last piece of the puzzle." Julian felt his consciousness splintering, his memories being drained away like water from a broken glass. He saw flashes of the people who lived here before him, a young woman from the 1920s, a grieving father from the 50s, a runaway teenager from the 90s, all of them trapped in the marrow of the house, their faces pressed against the reverse side of the wallpaper, their eyes peering through the knots in the wood. The house wasn't just built of stone and mortar. It was a living record of every soul that had ever stepped through its front door. The walls began to bleed a thick, black ichor that tasted of copper and sorrow, flooding the floor until Julian was submerged in a sea of ink. He tried to swim, but the weight of the teeth in his skin pulled him down into the depths of the foundation. He could see the skeletal remains of the manor's true architect, a man who had sold his lineage to something that lived in the lightless voids between stars. Below the foundation, time ceased to have any meaning. Julian found himself drifting through a subterranean labyrinth made of calcified bone and petrified screams. Every step he tried to take was met with the resistance of 1,000 phantom hands grabbing at his ankles, pulling him deeper into the architectural throat of the Blackwood estate. He realized then that the house was not just a predator, but a digestive system for the damned. He saw the unfinished ones, souls whose bodies had been partially consumed, their torsos fused into the support beams, their eyes serving as the glass in the windows. They blinked in unison, a rhythmic, agonizing flicker that synced with the thumping in the walls. The air here was composed of the final breaths of everyone who had died in the house, a stale, suffocating miasma that tasted of old iron and forgotten names. Julian reached out to touch a wall, and his fingers sank into it as if the plaster were made of cooling wax. He felt a sudden, sharp jolt of electricity as the house began to feed on his childhood memories. He saw his mother's face dissolve into a cluster of gray mold, his first bike turn into a pile of rusted nails, and his first love's laughter transform into the screeching of crows. The house was stripping him of everything that made him human, preparing him to be a silent, nameless brick in its ever-expanding walls. Suddenly, the darkness broke, and Julian found himself standing in the hallway of the first floor, the sun shining brightly through the stained glass. For a moment, he felt a surge of hope, thinking it had all been a nightmarish hallucination. But when he tried to speak, no sound came out. He reached up to touch his face and felt only smooth, unbroken skin where his mouth used to be. He rushed to the hallway mirror, but there was no reflection waiting for him, only an empty space where a man should be. He watched in horror as a "new for sale" sign was hammered into the front lawn by an invisible hand. A car pulled into the driveway, and a young couple stepped out, laughing and pointing at the beautiful, historic architecture. Julian tried to bang on the window to scream, to warn them to run as fast as their legs could carry them, but his hands passed through the glass like smoke. He was no longer a tenant. He was a haunt, a silent witness to the cycle that was about to begin again. As the couple stepped into the foyer, the husband remarked on how solid the house felt, how quiet and peaceful it seemed. They didn't notice the faint, rhythmic scratching coming from behind the baseboards, nor did they see the small, wooden hatch with the rusted iron bolt that had just appeared in the corner of their new bedroom. Julian watched from the ceiling, his soul tethered to the rafters, as the house began to grow its new set of teeth. But the horror was only beginning. As the sun began to set on the couple's first night, Julian realized he wasn't alone in the shadows of the ceiling. The thin, red creature was there, coiled like a serpent around the chandelier, its eyes fixed on the young woman below. It turned its elongated neck toward Julian and let out a sound like a wet violin string snapping. "Watch," it commanded in that same bone-deep vibration. "Watch how we expand." The creature began to drip a viscous, translucent fluid onto the floorboards, which soaked in instantly, turning the wood into a pulsing, organic membrane. The young couple sat on their bed, oblivious to the fact that the mattress was slowly growing thin, needle-like hairs that were gently piercing their skin, anchoring them to the house. Julian fought against his spectral chains, trying to manifest enough energy to tip over a lamp or shatter a glass. But the house absorbed his every effort, turning his desperation into more fuel for its hunger. He watched as the husband's shadow began to detach itself from his feet, crawling up the wall toward the ceiling, where it merged with Julian's own fatting form. He felt a sickening sensation of being doubled, his consciousness being stretched thin across the entire room. He was becoming the floorboards they walked on, the air they breathed, and the very nightmare they would wake up screaming from. The house groaned, a sound the couple mistook for the settling of old timber, but Julian knew better. It was the sound of a stomach settling after a feast. As the moon rose, the walls of the bedroom began to bleed a faint, phosphorescent light, revealing the thousands of teeth embedded in the plaster, all gnashing in a silent, subterranean hunger. Julian realized then that he wouldn't just watch them die. He would be forced to participate in their consumption, his own soul providing the teeth that would eventually tear their lives away. The front door clicked shut once more, a final, heavy thud that echoed through the void, sealing the couple inside a grave made of luxury and history. And in the silence that followed, Julian heard a new sound, the sound of his own voice, now a distant, distorted echo, beginning to whisper the husband's name from the darkness of the vents.